welcome everybody to our research seminar sessions. We have the pleasure today of having two very important people in this virtual seminar. We have Professor Suzanne de Treville, who is the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Operations Management, and our own affiliated faculty, Professor Mark Pagell. He's a professor of sustainable supply chain management at UCD in Ireland, and the co-editor-chief of Journal of Supply Chain Management. These are two very important, the top journals in the operations and supply chain management. And Mark has kindly offered to talk about a very important topic in our field, the issue of replicability or replication of research. Replication is one of the fundamental dimensions of scientific inquiry. So what we're going to do with this seminar, Suzanne will first introduce the paper that Mark is going to talk about, and then she's going to pass it on to Mark. After the Mark's presentation, we're going to have a Q&A session. The whole process will last about an hour and a half. I will be looking at the questions that you may be posting on the chat. So please, everybody who's joining, and we'll join in a minute, mute your microphones and ask the questions in the chat feed. And when Mark finishes the presentation, you may have the opportunity then to unmute your microphone and turn on your camera, and you can join the discussion as well. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Professor Suzanne de Treville to make the introduction, and I will mute my mic.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So if all goes well, I'm now sharing my screen. All good? Mm-hmm. Perfect. So the idea for this paper came, I served together with Tyson Browning, as was just mentioned, as co-editors-in-chief of the Journal of Operations Management. And we wanted to have a paper on this topic. So I asked Mark to write it, and he did. And that's why we're here today. So that I thought it might be useful to have a couple of words about Journal of Operations Management to highlight why we feel that this particular topic is so important. So a Journal of Operations Management is a journal that focuses on operations management, publishing scholarly research. We go for academic, we go for practical relevance. We call ourselves empirically focused. And by the way, the journal is now 40 years old this year. So that at the journal, we think a lot about the knowledge creation process. So what does it mean to say that to become able to say that you know something? So we have as a working definition for science that we're learning from observation. If you have learning in the absence of observation, it's philosophy. But we would like to have the observation. And so by empirical, we loosely translate empirical to mean that we are observing something that happens. And the question is, what do we need to think about as we go to transform what we've observed into something that we know? Now, the gold standard is generalization, and that's what we all long for. And so we get papers that say there is a gap because people figured out that if you drive a red Volkswagen, these things happen, but it has not been extended to what happens if you do the same thing with a purple Volkswagen. Or one editor-in-chief referred to, gravity works in my kitchen. But the idea is that we observe something and we would like to be able to generalize it. Typically, we can't do that. Typically, some work is required along the way. First of all, we can take what we've observed and we can transform it into empirical grounding for a research question. This is something that we're trying to emphasize at the journal. Don't just jump right to generalization and then make claims that don't hold water. Let's start by really deciding that we have good arguments for why a given research question needs to be asked. Uh, the other thing that happens when we make observations is that we take an accepted theory, we know exactly what's going to happen, we implement it, and then we have a, oh my goodness, is the way that we expect. And then we revise the theory, we realize there are other theories that are relevant, we put all of that together, and we come up with a stronger theory. We can add abduction to induction and deduction, taking into consideration the things that happened that were unexpected. And one of the things that we're emphasizing is that rather than talking about proof, we're talking about warrant. We're presenting arguments for why something matters, arguments for why truth claims might be worth holding. Now, so we put together our observations and we say, what exactly did we learn? Why should it be? Key question, can we do it again? Can it be replicated? And so that this positions the question of replication and how we're thinking about this knowledge creation process. So with that, I will pass it over to Mark.
Okay. So hopefully you can see what I'm doing. As Suzanne and Mihalis said, I'm going to be talking about replication. I'm going to be doing it as both a member of the faculty at UCD and a member of the faculty at Audencia. This is based on the following paper, which is available online from the Journal of Operations Management now. And what I'm going to do in the next 40 to 45 minutes or so is that I'll talk about what the replication crisis is and why it matters. And then I'll talk mostly about what you should do about it, but to get to that will require explaining why I'm making the suggestions I'm making, so why I'm focusing on a specific path, and then leave some time at the end to talk about what all this might mean. So there's an awful lot of really good discussion in a wide variety of scientific disciplines, both social sciences and physical sciences, about the replication crisis. And I'm just going to summarize that on the slide, basically. And it boils down to two main things. The first is that, as Suzanne noted, a key component of building knowledge is that we have to see if we can find the same thing again. In other words, finding it once is interesting, but it doesn't mean anything unless we can replicate that relationship, that we can show that it holds in many settings over time and so on. Yet we tend not to do tests to actually validate previous findings. And this is for a variety of reasons. One is that journals, and when I say journals, I'm including the one that I edit, but journals are biased to novelty, contribution, impact. In other words, when you look at the mission statement from the typical journal, there's not a lot of application that is really well done, but tells us that what we already believe to be true is indeed true. In other words, that's going to have a lot of trouble meeting our bar for contribution, that's interesting, and so on. In addition, and this doesn't sound like it's related to replication, but it is indirectly, we're biased to publishing significant results. So biased to publishing significant results that many authors don't even bother to submit their studies when they don't find that the relationships are significant. Now, what this means is that there are a lot of incentives to then find things that are significant. In other words, because we're so biased to the significant, we create incentives for people to engage in questionable practices. Now, questionable practices it's a lovely academic term in that it's really vague and it covers a huge span. That, you know, we can talk anything from, oh, what happens if we drop our outliers, which, if done transparently, is probably not questionable, to, but if done without telling people that you got to drop your outliers to get to significant, would be questionable, to creating your own data. The point here is that anytime we're creating incentives to engage in questionable practices, be they minor or major, the way this feeds into the replication crisis is that that incentive increases the odds of your paper getting published, decreases able to find the same thing as you. So when we put those things together, we don't do tests to validate what we've learned previously. And there's reason to believe that at least some of those tests that were done before probably aren't right. Now, the question is, what percentage of previous research should be replicable? I've never really thought about this until I read this article. So the Open Science Collaboration did a study in 2015 where they replicated 100, they would say, seminal studies in psychology. Of those 100, I'll note that 97 had significant results. So that shows you our bias to the significant. Only 36 of the replications were significant. In other words, less of their attempts to replicate were successful. Now, again, I don't know what percentage of studies should replicate, but let's assume that that 40% had no questionable practices whatsoever. In other words, if 40% is the percentage of studies we should expect to replicate, if we do, but we don't actually do replication, we have a real problem. Because what that means is that we are building our foundations for our science. And the foundations of our science are the theories, facts, and predictions that we accept as knowledge, as true. Yet if only 40% of our seminal studies would replicate if we did it, that means those foundations are really, really iffy. And that's the real crisis. The replication crisis is not about doing more replication studies, because often when people present these two facts, they then say the solution is to do more replication studies. But the problem is not the lack of replication studies per se, it's what the lack of replication studies means for our theories, facts, and predictions. And so my starting point going into this is that, of course, more replication studies would help. And I am all for doing more of these studies. But when Suzanne asked me to write this paper and I started thinking about replication, one of the first things that was pretty clear pretty quickly is that a focus on replication studies, while easy, had two problems. One, I would just be repeating previous papers on this topic. And two, I don't think that bemoaning the lack of replication studies is going to lead to us doing more replication studies. So, you know, when, again, you look at most journals' criteria for publication, and again, including the one that I co-edited, replications, we all say we're interested in them, but you're going to have to do a rather special replication to get published in a high impact journal. Either it's going to have to be both very, very robust and show us something that we believe to be true probably isn't. That's probably what you're going to have to do to get published in our top journals. And equally, when you look at the criteria at most universities for promotion and tenure, they talk about things like novel contribution, how done for science in your discipline, and so on. In other words, well, I'm sure somebody in the world could get tenure or promoted by doing only replication studies. Most of us could not. So journals create disincentives. Our own promotion and tenure paths wherever we work create disincentives. And so while some journals have taken the path, so like for instance, the Journal Marketing Behavior has a replication corner, that's their response. And it's kind of cool. These are short studies, or at least in terms of tests, they're short studies, 2,000 words or so, to replicate something that's been done relatively recently. And that's cool, but between our incentives and the fact that that works really well for behavioral research, where your population is things like consumers. They're relatively easy to find. But it doesn't work very well for a lot of other organizational level research. So when you think about the research that many of us do in supply chain management or management in general, where our level of analysis is a firm or relationships between firms or even networks as a whole, it's really difficult to do a replication inexpensively. In other words, the resource requirements to do a good replication in most of business are as high as doing a new study. And yet your likelihood of getting published in a good journal is going to be lower, and its contribution to your getting promoted is going to be lower. We're just never going to do large amounts of replication studies, or at least I don't think we will. So then the question is, what could we do differently? And so what I'm going to present is what I think we can do that addresses the problem without necessarily doing more replication studies. And it's really kind of grounded in both that reality of our incentives, but also the way that I think that supply chain and operations people address problems, in that one of our fundamental concerns is eliminating unnecessary redundancy. And the question then becomes, replication is a form of necessary redundancy. So how do we make sure that we're doing necessary redundancy without creating unnecessary redundancy? So that's what I'm going to propose to you. And my fundamental premise is this: that when we do theory testing and refining research, so I'm not talking about all research we do, but I'm talking about what's often classified as normal science, abduction and deduction, research that starts with hypotheses, that starts with previous findings in theory, that we are in essence doing a form of what is called differentiated replication. And I'll define differentiated replication in a second, so bear with me. In other words, this all inductive and deductive research, or almost all of it, starts with a theory. And typically it's got a sentence like this, and this sentence is taken from my own research, right? It says the results from previous studies addressing this relationship are inconsistent. Hence, we enter the debate by exploring the role of safety and operational performance in a unique context. In other words, this is normal science. It's looking at constructs that are already familiar, a relationship that we already have at least some sense of what it might be in terms of strength and direction, and we're attempting to confirm what that relationship would be, refine it, or extend it. And so my premise is this: that we can address the quote unquote replication crisis by doing research of this nature, by doing theory testing and refining research in a more systematic fashion. And if we do that, we can both deal with or acknowledge the incentives to publish new knowledge, while also efficiently helping to make sure that the foundations of that knowledge are generalizable, that they're not based on idiosyncratic, spurious, or questionable findings. Now, to launch into this, I have to take a step back, and we have to be careful, because often when we talk about replication, we talk about it the way people in the physical sciences would talk about it. And in the physical sciences, it's possible to do a pure replication. A pure replication is an exact replication, a true replication, where nothing changes from one study to the next, but perhaps the lab in which the experiment is done. But that's only one form of replication. There are many forms of replication. Uncles and Kwok define it this way. They think about a study having a conceptual, methodological, and substantive domain. And then when we talk about exact replication, we don't vary any of that. So the conceptual domain, what constructs are we interested in? The methodological, how do we test the relationship? The substantive, the context that we're operating in, all that remains the same in an exact or true replication. Then we have close replications where there might be slight variation. And then finally, there's differentiated replication, where there is variation in perhaps the conceptual. Maybe we change a construct, maybe we change the methodology, maybe we try it in a different context, whatever, right? We vary that, but we do it in a deliberate, purposeful manner. And if you think about theory testing, refining research, I would argue it is a form of differentiated replication, in that when we go forth to confirm or extend previous research, we start with what we already know. We start with the constructs that have previously been defined and usually measured, and so on. And then we combine that in some manner to try and build on. In other words, I would argue we're actually doing replication now, but typically when we do theory testing and refining research, we don't acknowledge the intent to replicate. And that's probably both because we want our research to look new and novel to increase its likelihood of getting published, and maybe because we don't necessarily think of it as replication. So because we don't, first and foremost, we don't acknowledge it. In addition, and this is especially a problem in social sciences like business, and it may be most problematic in management, we use a wide variety of methods and research designs. In other words, in any literature you look at, there'll be numerous studies that relate in terms of their conceptual domain. They will be looking at the same or similar relationship. What is the role of trust in buyer-supplier relationships? There are probably thousands of articles on that specific question in the supply chain management literature. So the focal constructs remain the same, the general research question remains the same, but in those thousands of articles, each one seems to measure trust or the buyer-supplier relationship differently. They use different methods to test the relationship, the context change. In other words, the studies are in the same conceptual domain, but they don't really overlap in terms of the empirics. Now, if after a number of these studies, everything points in the same direction, we always find trust is good, we start to build knowledge that we can depend on. In other words, that variety is useful if all of the studies go in the same direction. The problem is when those studies go in different directions, we can never be sure if the lack of consistent results is because of the different measures, the different constructs, the different controls. In other words, we don't know why we're finding different results. And we end up doing ever more additional studies without reaching a conclusion. If you want to think about it, we're doing a lot of confirmatory work in a manner that's more suited to exploratory work. When we're doing confirmatory work, when we're starting with theory and previous empirical findings, when we're doing theory testing and refining, we don't want to just make conceptual linkages to what's been done before, we want to make empirical linkages to what's been done before. And this is important because one of the things, and I'll probably say this twice today, one of the things that we all know, or at least we learn as academics, is that when you submit a paper and you find what you're supposed to find, nobody really questions it. But if your paper finds something that's different from what previous research has found, that's your problem. In other words, we tend to, and probably rightfully so, we tend to assume that something has been through the peer review process, that has been published, that has been used by others, that's been found useful, is right. And so when you come along and you find something different, it's your responsibility to be able to explain why. Why is it that you found something different? What else is it that changed your results from the past? In other words, you have to be able to empirically say why you got inconsistent results. Is it because you sampled from a different population, a different industry? Did you change from a manufacturing setting to a service setting? Is it because of how you operationalized one of the focal constructs? Is it because you used different controls? Is it something else in the research design? And those questions are relatively difficult to answer if you change the empirical setting, the measures, and the controls between studies, because there's too much that's changed. But if you're careful about the way you design your studies, you can answer these questions and you can empirically situate your research and past research as opposed to just conceptually situate. You can start to build replication into your theory testing and refine. And so what I'm basically going to argue for the second half of the talk here is if we want to be able to answer these questions when we're doing theory testing and refining research, we should design that research following replication logic. Now, often when we talk about replication logic, we're talking in a multiple case study setting where subsequent cases are used to confirm or not previous cases. So each additional case we do is chosen systematically, and it's used to confirm or not what we think we found in previous cases, much like what you see in multiple experimental studies. And it's basically the same idea in this context, but I'm talking broadly about all theory testing and refining research, so any methodology goes here. And here what we're talking about is the systematic varying of one, or at least a very small number of design elements between different studies that test the same relationship. And that allows us to understand why the current results do or do not replicate previous studies. In other words, again, we're working in the same domain, but we want to tie things together empirically, which means that we have to systematically choose what we vary. Do we vary the measures, the context, the samples, and so on? To make this happen, I'm going to suggest 4 actions. I'm going to present these actions as independent, but they clearly aren't. Especially the second and third really sort of bleed into each other, but there are 4 things that I think would make a big difference in terms of increasing the likelihood. Again, what we're after here is theories, facts, and predictions that we can rely on, that are valid. And I think all these things will help with that. The first is transparency. When I talk about transparency, I usually talk about it from the standpoint that every empirical manuscript should have a clear path from raw data to the results. And this clear path needs to be there for 2 purposes. The first is so that reviewers and readers can judge the validity of your findings. That's about internal validity. They need to know what you did. How did you collect data? Who did you sample from? What did you do with outliers if you did anything? What analysis method did you use, and so on, so that they can see the path from data to results to understand whether or not they are comfortable with it. Do they believe that this is valid? The other reason you need to provide that information is that absent that information, nobody can replicate your work. So providing transparency is both to allow people to judge the validity of the results in the present study and to allow future researchers to replicate some or all of your work in the future. This shouldn't be a problem. At least I don't think it should be a problem. I don't think any of us view this as controversial until it comes time to write our papers, because when you look at Aquinas et al.'s work, and certainly there are others, but this is in management, so that's why I picked it. When you look at their work, there are large problems with transparency in terms of what gets published in many of our best journals. Now, this happens for a variety of reasons. One, I think, is a legacy. And it's a legacy of the fact that journals used to actually be published on physical paper, and page limits were a hard and fast thing. And a lot of us still write as if we have 30 pages of text, and whatever doesn't fit in there just sort of disappears. But that's not today's reality. You may still only have 30 pages of text, but you can also create an online supplement. There are data depositories. In other words, there are lots of ways to get beyond the page limits. So page limits are a legacy issue, that shouldn't be an issue, any problem anymore. In addition, authors rightfully try and present their work in the best light. But remember, there's a difference between presenting your work in the best light and hiding questionable practices. Right? So I understand saying we make a large contribution when maybe your contribution is relatively incremental. That is very different from you drop 10% of the sample because they were quote unquote outliers so that you could get significant results, and you don't tell us about that in the paper. One of those is marketing, the other is an ethical breach that makes it impossible to replicate your work. So to start to do replications within existing studies or within larger theory testing and refining studies, or really replication at all, we first and foremost need transparency. So as a reviewer, you need to demand this. Now, how you demand it probably varies by the journal you're reviewing for and your own comfort with it. But certainly you should never say, this paper should be accepted, but the authors need to tell us more about what they did. You can't accept the paper until you know what the authors did. Depending on the journal and depending on how much is missing, maybe you can't review the paper until the authors provide that information, but you need to demand that information. As an author, you need to provide it, whether it's in the paper itself, in an appendix, in an online supplement, available in a repository, or whatever. That's step one. The second step has to do with nomological or predictive validity. Now, a nomological network is a network of constructs. So it's a network that shows how constructs are related to each other in terms of causality. So what is an antecedent or an outcome of the construct that I'm interested in the present study? What's the nature of the relationship? Is it positive? Is it negative? We don't expect a relationship. And the strength of that relationship. Is it strong, weak? How big is the effect size? And what's important here is if you think about theory testing and refining research, it mostly, and I'm saying mostly because I can't find an example where this isn't true, but I'm sure somebody can. But theory testing and refining research mostly examines how constructs that are familiar relate to unfamiliar ways. If you want to say this differently, and probably better, it's the rare theory testing or refining study that includes constructs that have not been previously situated in a nomological network. Now, let me be clear here. I'm not saying every construct has been situated in a nomological network. In other words, it's pretty typical theory testing or refining research to take an existing nomological network and to add one new construct to it. If you think about sustainability research, a lot of sustainability, especially early sustainability research, started with what we already knew about how do companies create profits, and we added a new construct in the dependent variable of environmental impacts, right? So most theory testing and refining research either adds a new construct to an existing nomological network or links to previously unconnected nomological networks. In other words, some to a large percent, some to all of the constructs you're looking at are already situated in a nomological network, which means that we can do tests of nomological or predictive validity. Nomological validity is the idea of looking at that network of antecedents and outcomes to address the question of does it predict or covary with those with which it is supposed to. Many people use nomological and predictive validity interchangeably. Some are a little more precise, and they would say that predictive validity is a special case of nomological validity where you only look at one antecedent or one outcome. But the idea for both is the same. You're looking at this construct in its wider network of other constructs to see if it behaves as expected. So let me give you a quick example here. This is from my own work. This is a study we did, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. And the study was on how operational practices, and the practices were already familiar, so well-established construct with existing valid measures, and how they related to safety outcomes. That was our research question. That was the area of interest. So that's the dashed line on the slide. Those constructs are already situated in a nomological network. Actually, both operational practices and safety outcomes are already situated in their own nomological networks. We know how those operational practices have related to operational outcomes such as cost of production, quality, flexibility, delivery time, and so on. That's been tested numerous times by others. We're not interested in that in this study, but one of the first things we did in this study was we tested the relationship between operational practices as measured by us in this sample with operational outcomes. And the reason we're doing this is because if the operational practices, as we've measured them in this sample, behave as they have previously, we've actually started to eliminate 2 serious concerns that are typical reasons for rejection. So if you think about research design reasons why your paper might get rejected, one is about the sample. Is your sample, are your results because you've just sampled poorly or you've got a weird sample? Well, if we can show, and it's not on the slide, but if our sample is shown to be representative, we've partially eliminated that. And then we add this test. And what this test shows is that the sample's valid, or at least it's a valid representation of the population, and the construct, as we've measured it, behaves as expected. In other words, we don't have a biased sample, and we don't have construct validity problems. Those 2, construct validity problems and sampling problems, are 2 large reasons why empirical papers don't progress through the review process. By doing this test of predictive validity, we have reduced the likelihood that that is true. In other words, we've increased the likelihood of whatever we find about the relationship between operational practices and safety outcomes is also valid. So by doing a test that, quote unquote, isn't directly in our research, or if you prefer, by doing a test to replicate previous research on the relationship between operational practices and operational outcomes, we also increase the veracity of what we're actually interested in. We build a more solid foundation for what we expect, what we think we already know, and a more solid foundation for the new knowledge. Now, to do these tests requires us to actually build them into our research design. So we need to do research designs that account for replication logic. And really, this is about being able to explain our results and go back to what I said previously about, when we find what we expect, and of course it's significant, we never really question why. I know we found what we expected, we got the right results, we write it up, we try and make it look more novel than it is, and we're done. But when we find nothing, so we find insignificant relationship, or we thought there was a significant relationship, or worse, I guess, we find the opposite of what we're supposed to expect, it's on us to explain why. It's striking to me that when I deal with my colleagues, when I work with junior faculty at other places or PhD students, we often don't plan for this, which in management is just, to me, that's just a bad idea. If you think in management specifically, we work in a context that is dynamic. The context is always changing. In addition, we use a wide variety of measures, methods, and so on. In other words, we should be finding the wrong thing all the time. And we should, as researchers, be planning for this, both because it's important to address the replication crisis, but also just to cover our own butts. In other words, a lot of what I'm talking about in this research design section is both about replication and, in essence, it's an insurance policy for you. You're able to answer those questions I asked earlier. Why is it I didn't find what I thought I would find? And the cool thing here is that if you are really strategic about this and you do it up front, you can design your research so that this is relatively easy to do. In other words, there are ways to design your research where you embed what are now becoming common. So robustness checks have become kind of an expectation now in empirical research, or maybe they weren't 10 years ago. But robustness checks are typically about internal validity. Can we trust the results of this study? I'm going to argue, and I'll show you an example in a second, that with careful strategic design, I can embed those robustness checks and embed tests of nomological validity without increasing the cost dramatically, or at least not necessarily increasing the cost dramatically, and while giving myself an insurance policy to be able to explain why I didn't find what I expected to find. So this is a second example. This is a stylized example for simplicity. On the left, or at least what I hope is your left, the simple model, what it shows is a fairly typical robustness check of where we change the operationalization or the measure of one of the focal constructs. And the idea with this robustness check is that if we measure this focal construct in multiple ways and we get the same results, that increases our confidence that the results do indeed hold for this study in this context. In other words, increased internal validity. And we typically do this test where the operationalizations of that focal construct are, some or all of them are unique to our study. Two potential problems here. One is, of course, if those findings are inconsistent with nothing else going on, you can't explain why. So this test only works if you find that they're both significant, they both point in the same way, and the effect size is about the same. Right? So it falls apart if the results are inconsistent, and you can't explain why if both operationalizations of that focal construct are unique. Now, the other model, and again, this is a stylized example, so bear with me. The other model, what it shows is that we followed advice that most, if not all of us, probably got in the PhD process, which is that if you're measuring something where there's already a validated measure, use it. In other words, if somebody else has already created a valid measure of this construct and you can use it, you should. Creating new measures is difficult, and it's difficult to prove that they have high levels of construct validity. Someone else has done the work, let them do it. So what you see on the right-hand side here, the more complicated model, if you will, is that we again have operationalized the focal construct in two ways, but one of them is as previously operationalized in other studies. In other words, that's our first empirical link to previous research. The second empirical link to previous research is our choice of antecedents. Now, I probably should have called these controls because that's what they are. But we've chosen controls that we already know how they're related to our focal construct. In other words, we've used the nomological network to say what things do we know are related to this focal construct? What's the strength and direction of the relationship? Now, by designing this way, what we've got here is by both having one of the measures is empirically linked to previous work and the antecedents are previously linked to previous work, what we find relative to those two operationalizations becomes much less important. If they both point in the same direction, we're still good. But if they point in opposite directions, we can probably start to answer questions such as the key question as to why. Is one of them better than the other? Well, to determine one is better than the other, which one is related to the antecedents in the expected manner? If one of them is and one isn't, that's the better measure. So choose the results from that one. If they're both related to the antecedents in the expected way, but they don't relate to the dependent variable in the same way, then we can probably dig into the actual construction of the measures. What's different between them? And does that explain? In other words, moving from that, again, simple stylized model on the left to the model on the right, by putting this thing into the nomological network and by measuring it both in a new way and as previously, we've created those empirical ties to previous research. We can explain why our results aren't the same. And in addition, we've done a lot of replication, right? Those tests of the antecedents are replications. Those changing the operationalizations, that's related to replication. Again, we're building those foundations of knowledge while also doing something new. And that thinking can be applied to many other changes as well. So the quick example, it's an easy example to do. This is Zhang and Jia in 2013 replicated kind of a classic study in operations management. So the original study was done in 1997, looking at how quality management related to operational performance. And you can imagine that in the mid to late 90s, being good at quality was a way to get customers, while by the mid 2015-ish, being good at quality was probably expected from customers, but it wouldn't win you customers. In other words, being bad at it would be a problem. Being good at it wouldn't necessarily get you customers. And that was kind of the fundamental premise of this paper. But as is typically true, in the intervening, what do we have there, 16 years, you would expect that in 16 years, our methodological knowledge and expectations would have changed. And they, of course, wanted to use the most up-to-date, most robust methods. That's fine, but now they're changing two things. One, they're changing the context, and they're also changing the methodology. Which means that if the results were between the first study and the replication were inconsistent, they need to be able to tell me, was it because of the methods or was it because the context changed? Now, their solution here, and again, this is relatively easier compared to some things, their solution was to do the analysis twice. They did the analysis the way it was done originally, and they did it a second time using the new methods, which allowed them to make much stronger inferences about why and where the studies were similar or different. Now, obviously, the example I just gave, where we had basically carefully chose controls, when you probably have controls in the model, and we just need to measure one construct twice, or this example where they did the analysis twice, that's a whole lot resource intensive than where you're looking at a new sample or in a different industry and so on. But the point is that this can be applied to other changes in your methodology, in your constructs, context, and so on. And this allows us to create those empirical linkages to previous work, to create that replication component inside of a larger study. The last piece of this picture is part of what I've already been talking about, which is controls. So as I've been hinting at, controls are a form of replication, or at least they should be. Good use of control variables basically boils down to two things. One is that they are chosen because theory and or previous research links them to the constructs of interest. In other words, controls are part of that construct's nomological network. They're antecedents or consequences of what you're actually interested in, and there's theory and or previous empirical work that tells you that relationship does indeed hold. This is its direction, this is its strength. So best practice in control variables says that you need to have that information and you need to measure them well. If you've got both those things, that's good use of control variables. Unfortunately, we rarely follow best practice. So when you look at the use of controls, and again, this is based on Boyd's work here, Carlson, Wu, and others, the theoretical justification is often missing. The measures are often poor. And then there are often transparency problems as well. So the controls won't be in the correlation matrix. And this is something that drives me mad, and it happens a lot now, where people say, oh, my controls are included. You give me a table that says controls included, but you don't actually tell me the relationships. Well, if you don't tell me that, what you've basically done is you've hidden the replication component of your study, which is highly problematic. And it gets worse because in a lot of studies, there's no follow-up if the controls don't behave as expected. And I think we've all seen studies where they have a large number of controls, most of which are insignificant. As a reader or reviewer, this should be troubling. This means that assuming the controls were put in there for the right reasons, they're there because of their place in the nomological network is well specified and they're well measured, that means that the theory about those controls is wrong, or the main results in this research are wrong. At a minimum, controls not behaving as expected requires an explanation. And that explanation might be one of your key contributions. But of course, that's premised on the assumption that controls were actually well thought out and well measured. But when we look back, unfortunately, what we see is often the controls are not there for good reasons theoretically. They haven't been previously situated in a nomological network. And the measures are often pretty weak proxies. And that should get you thinking, because then it leads to the question of, if that's the case, what exactly was controlled for and what do the results really mean? Right? If it's a poor proxy, what did they really capture? Especially if it's significant. And so here again, we can start to take immediate action. As a reviewer, you should ask people to use controls appropriately. And you should not be saying, you know, previous studies had firm size as a control, you should include it. Firm size should be included because it's in the nomological network and we know how it behaves, not because previous studies have included it, unless they've also included it for a good reason. You have to use controls appropriately. You have to treat tests of control like any other test in nomological validity, and you have to report these tests. You should demand that as a reviewer. You should do these things as an author. Now, when I look at those four actions, transparency and control should already be part of your research process. In other words, I'm going to argue they're free. If there's a cost to you to doing that, that just means that your present research needs to be improved. I probably could have said that in a nicer fashion. There is room for continuous improvement if that is not already part of your current research design. The building replication logic and test of nomological validity into your designs will have a cost. But I'm going to argue that the cost is lower than two things. From a discipline or domain standpoint, it's lower than the cost of doing standalone replication studies. In other words, and especially go back to that early point I made, that when we're doing work, especially at the firm level of analysis or above, network studies and so on, replications are going to be just as resource intensive to conduct as any other theory testing and refining research. So building this into a study that adds something new is going to be less expensive. from a domain standpoint. We're going to build good foundations more efficiently. From an individual standpoint, this is your insurance policy. This is the, no matter what I find, I can publish my results without doing anything iffy. And that's a whole lot cheaper than doing a study, getting insignificant results, and throwing it away. So yes, there are costs to doing this, but these costs need not be excessive. And I would argue they're still less than doing lots of replication studies. What those costs are going to vary, right? Adding a few additional constructs to a protocol, probably not a big deal. Collecting multiple ways to measure something in an archival data set, probably not a big deal. Measuring a key construct in multiple ways, depends. Expanding to a second context, that might start to cost you a bit more in terms of time and money. But if you think about it, that's what every multiple experiment paper does or should do. And obviously, as the need grows, the cost will grow. But for a lot of us doing normal science, doing your theory testing and refining research, this is already relatively easy, relatively cheap to design in, and it's a whole lot cheaper than doing research you can't publish. To make this happen, it's going to require a shift in expectations from reviewers and editors. Part of that shift, I think, has already started to happen. If you think about it, one of the things that Suzanne and I both didn't talk about, but when we were having our initial conversation about my writing this paper, she noted that in 2006, the Journal of Operations Management had done a special issue on replication. And that was kind of the last thing anybody in the operations or supply chain domain had done on replication. And one of the things the guest editors of that special issue noted was they had a really hard time getting reviewers because reviewers didn't want to review papers that were about what they already know. And arguably, tests of nomological validity are tests of what we already know. But if you think about it, robustness checks, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, you read a lot of empirical articles now, and there are 10 pages of robustness checks. Those also don't tell us anything new, but we've gotten pretty used to it. So adding tests of nomological validity, yes, at one level it's something new, and we have to get used to seeing a test that doesn't tell us anything new, a new test that doesn't tell us anything new. Sorry for that sentence, it's not a very good one. But because we're used to seeing robustness checks, I hope this will be relatively easy to do. And it's certainly really important because that's how we build the foundations to our theories, facts, and predictions, right? Even if they are tangential to this study, they are important to the discipline. When it comes to transparency, you got to get used to being asked for your data or your code. It's just started in the operations and supply chain realm. In management in general, it's still also relatively rare. But when you look to psychology or economics, and certainly to other disciplines like medicine, it is expected that you share your data. It is expected that you share your code. You've got to start to get used to that as an author. And as a reviewer, you need to start to get used to asking for it. I need this information to do my review process properly. Without it, I can't. As a reviewer, if you find yourself rejecting a paper for insignificant results, stop and think about why. We've all, or at least I have recently, so I'm going to assume everybody's had this experience, gotten a review back that basically says you don't have enough significant results. That shouldn't matter. That said, hopefully what the reviewer was trying to say was that if your results are insignificant when you expected to find something, and the nomological network says that you expected to find something that had a positive and relatively strong relationship, and you don't find that, the onus is on you to show me why. In other words, as a reviewer, you should not be rejecting paper because the results are insignificant. You should be rejecting paper because the authors can't explain why it is they didn't find what they, quote unquote, should have. If they can explain why, if they can show you that because we changed the context or because we used a new measure or a different methodology, if that explains it and they've, again, situated what they're doing presently, empirically in past work, that's not a reason to reject, even if it's insignificant. If they can't do that, it is, but it's not about the significance per se, it's about the research design. And so that means as an author, you need to start designing your theory, testing, and refining work based on replication logic. Because hopefully going forward, that's going to be expected of you. And if it is, what that means is that we will start to address the replication crisis without actually having to do large numbers of pure replication studies. And again, if you do that for yourself, it's not just good for the discipline, but if all you care about is you, and of course, hopefully that's not you, but if it is, it's also good for you because that's your insurance policy so that you know that your work's going to be publishable no matter what you find. So that is the prepared part of my talk. I am now going to at least try to turn off my slides and have a conversation. Thank you for listening. Cool, Mihalis, over to you.
Mark, thank you so much. That was really inspiring. It generates a lot of questions, and in a way, it kind of like shakes the waters of the foundations of how we do research. I don't have any questions here in the chat, but I can open up the discussions to everybody. We're not a very large group. If you have a question, please go ahead, raise your hand, and unmute your microphone, ask the question.
Was that good or that bad?
I'm question then.
I think Thomas has a question. Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mark, first of all, for a great presentation. I remember a paper by Arjan van Velen and Erik van Rij in Journal of Supply Chain Management calling for more replication studies. And this was in the context of purchasing and supply management, and arguing that the lack of replication studies in our field, in purchasing and supply management also, is really a sign of a lack of maturity of the field as well. And I've always had that in the back of my mind as well, that their call for replication studies makes a lot of sense. I mean, I would like to see, I think it would be very interesting when we have studies that focus on, say, automotive industry, then others could pick up from that study and then basically replicate that study and focus on, say, fashion industry or something like that. Does it work there? I think it's something as a field we should be doing. I completely agree. Anyway, my question is, you talked a little bit about case studies used for replication, and you referred to yin and multiple cases, but then at least some of your suggested actions was really, I think, directed towards quantitative studies. So do you think that multiple case studies can be used also for replication studies? And if so, I mean, obviously the lessons about transparency and so on, I think they would still apply. But where do you think that replication studies using, for example, multiple case studies, how do you think they would be different?
Yes, and interestingly, this was part of the review process as well, because the paper is written and the talk was done, and I probably should have said this up front, that there is an implicit, this is quantitative research, but if you think about it, when you do a case study, we often talk about a blank slate, but the reality is when we go to collect data, if you start with a protocol, that protocol contains constructs in it that we already know something about. And we already know something, at least, about how we expect some of those constructs to behave. And so when I would argue that there is a replication component in many case studies as well. Now, obviously, the more novel the topic, the less of that replication component exists. And if you're really, truly doing pure theory building, maybe not, but so many case studies end up being presented as abductive anyway. That means that some component of that case study or multiple case studies is overlapping with stuff we already know, or we think we already know. And the same thing applies, right? If you're doing cases and in general, we accept that the use of continuous improvement leads to better operational performance, and in you're doing a case and one or more of your cases, continuous improvement is leading to worse operational performance, that means one of two things. Either what we all believe to be true is wrong, or there is something very unique about your case, right? And both of those things are important, and you should capture that and be able to explain it. So this is not just for quantitative research. I know, and again, that was my fault for how I presented it, but the same thing, really, any research that starts out embedded in a nomological network to some extent, it's in your best interest to be doing these things, because that's how you make sure that, all right, is my case really truly, when we talk about theoretical sampling in case studies, is it really truly capturing what it's supposed to capture? And if not, does that mean I've just learned something even cooler? Or does that mean I have to drop this case? And you would like to know that before you get to the review process, right?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Suzanne, I think you need to, yeah.
Yeah, so that's an absolutely fascinating question. And one of the things that came to me very strongly as I was listening to Mark's presentation is that replication is also embedded in what we call intervention-based research. So what is an intervention? An intervention is often a case of we take a basket of theories, we transform them into a method, we apply the method, and we do that with a pretty clear idea of how we expect things to change. We expect to go from state S to state S star. Well, what tends to happen in complex fields like management or biology is you're sure that you know what's going to happen, and you're really just dotting the I's and crossing the T's. You're thinking, I'm wasting my time, and then stuff that you would have never even thought about comes up. And this will often, this is an example of abductive logic kicking in. Then you often end up thinking of things that you never would have thought of without putting yourself in this situation. Now, if you don't, but what I am realizing is that intervention-based research is based on replication. Another thing that I wanted to add, so at JOM, we're seeing that this tends to be a problem. A key reason for rejecting otherwise well-written and interesting papers is overclaiming. And why do we overclaim? We overclaim because we think if we don't do great things, then we're going to be rejected. But we're trying as a journal to get this idea of relatively small steps, but that are taken very precisely. And as you take a step, it's like walking on ice. You take a little step and you first try to make sure that the ground is still holding, that you're not landing flat on your posterior, and then you try to make a little bit of progress. So one article that we found very useful in kind of stimulating our thinking is by Hambrick, 2007, wrote a paper on, by the way, we keep doing theory, but we often do it without putting in the work for pre-theory. And so I would argue that a lot of the time we're trying to build theory, but what we really want to do is to look at an intriguing regularity that we've observed, which may or may not be idiosyncratic. And then we want to come in and think about, is this an interesting thing to explore? And if we would put the effort into empirically grounding and providing warrant for the research questions that we then go to ask, I think that our research might have more of a payoff. So just a couple of things.
Yeah, we often talk about add a variable research, and we say kind of dismissively, but add a variable research done well, in other words, add one new construct to what we already know. If it's done well, that's probably the best way to take those small steps that Suzanne is talking about, right? Because then we're very sure what adding the variable to the model actually did. But we tend to try and make our add a variable research look fancier than it is. And then we lose that ability to, you know, we take a bigger step than we should have in a lot of cases.
So building on that, so Mark, what I think we as editors can do to encourage readers and reviewers is get better at expressing appreciation for small but well defended gains in territory. Dan Guide always talked about what's the delta? What do I know after this paper? At reading this paper that I didn't know before. And when you were giving the example of we shouldn't just reject a paper because the results are not significant, but we reject a paper because they haven't sufficiently defended their delta. Because you go in and you know that you're going to find something and you don't find it. We've got to have a way to publish that.
Totally agree.
So we
can I just take on this discussion about the role of the editors? And I think, Mark, you just painted it very well what sort of research design needs to be considered, to encourage replication. But from the point of view of policy or your role as editors, I was reading that in some fields, they encourage the pre-registration of the studies. So having a register prior to collecting the data and vetting this, and I mean that doesn't encourage, that doesn't necessarily mean that the paper will be published, but by vetting the study prior to the data collection, do you think that there's something that our journals should be doing as well to encourage this, replication logic?
When I answer about open science, I'm answering for myself, not for the journal or for Wisely. I'm a firm believer in most of, if not all of the kind of what's called open science. I think pre-registration is great. I think the idea that journals would, in some cases, they will review your pre-registered study before you do it with the, as long as you actually do what you said you were going to do, we're going to publish it no matter what you find. I think that's awesome. I think that sharing data is something we need to get a lot better at. So I'm all for all of those things, but I also know that those viewpoints are not necessarily shared across the disciplines. So I'm just speaking for myself.
So I can speak for JOM. So at JOM, JOM is owned by the ASCM, the former APICS. And so we have, from the time we came into this role almost 3 years ago, have been very willing to consider papers that would map out a study, and then we could work with ASCM for data collection and pre-accept the study, whatever the results are, and then serve as kind of an ambassadorial role to work on data collection. We have not had a single team of authors show up with a study. I think one thing is, okay, so Mark, let me see if you agree with this. But so one thing is that many of our research questions don't address things that people actually need to know. It's not like trying to find a cancer drug where you've got various levels of clinical trials. It's we have some data, we need to get things published, but there's not a certain passion that if we can figure this out, then we will be able to do new things. And I think that if we had that passion, then we'd be able to figure out what we need to know, go into define instruments, constructs, models, theory plus one construct, and go in and collect data and explore. But so I think we need to get more passionate about why the world needs to know the stuff that we do.
At some level, I disagree, because I think, especially when you link it to pre-registering a design, because when I talk to managers and they tell me what they want to know, half the time I can tell them we already know that. And the other half the time, what they want to know is, and this is my sustainability bias coming through, but they want to know, how do I exploit the planet and or my workers to make more money? And so, having worked in an area, and again, 30 years of doing research in sustainability, when we started, no manager wanted anything to do with this. So we would not have been able to get whatever Apex is now called to sign on to that study. We were passionate, we thought it was important, but we couldn't go about it that way, not because of a lack of passion, but because we were ahead of practice. And so often when I hear these discussions that we don't do practical enough research, I do worry that in the process of becoming practical, we then lose doing research that should be done, but practitioners don't care about it yet.
Totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. I'm talking about something something different, because I agree that many practitioners think of research as confirming their conventional wisdom, and they just like doing it. And our job, the reason why we exist, the reason why we're needed, and that somebody should pay us a salary, is to go in and break the conventional wisdom. Bring in the things that are the surprises, the nonlinearities, and help people build those into their decision tools. And so, and sustainability actually is an area where researchers come in with questions that do need to be answered. So I'm talking, maybe I could edit my question to say we need to have more of the kind of passion that we find in sustainability research. Would that help?
There you go. Perfect.
Is there anybody else from the audience who want to ask another question on the topic? I can follow up a quick technical question again to the editors, and that's to do with the statistical significance of our studies. Now, we tend to think that having a p-value of less than 0.05 is statistically significant. But do you think that you as editors should require statistical significance to be higher, that is to decrease the p-value to make the results more statistically significant? Otherwise, they should be published.
I think that's the wrong question.
Why is that?
I was amused. I didn't put this in the slides, but I was thinking about when I made the slides. When I was in grad school many, many decades ago, most of my methodology training was from the OB people. And they were already arguing about, should we even be reporting significance? And again, they're still reporting it now, but they're arguing about it in the 90s. Significant tests are relatively meaningless, especially as your sample size goes up. We just did a study here where our sample size was 11 million observations. Everything was significant at 0.000000001. Most of it was meaningless because the effect size was also pretty much zero. We should really be talking about effect sizes. Now, having said that, I also got a question from an author recently where they said, we were asked to report effect sizes. Is that okay? And so just the fact that I had to ask suggests that we've still got this hang up about significance. Significance in and of itself is pretty meaningless. An insignificant small effect size is obviously problematic. And an insignificant large effect size probably just means your sample wasn't big enough, and maybe there's something interesting there. But absent the effect size or a confidence interval, it's not good information. That said, I'm betting that 85% of what I review will just report significance no confidence interval, nothing else.
Well, the reason I guess I'm asking is to do with this publication bias, what is acceptable as statistical significant, and by increasing statistical significance, some people think that the replication or replicability of the research will be increased, but I get the point of misinterpreting the p-value and what it means. How about the issue of triangulation? And I think you addressed it a little bit with different methods, Omar. Should papers or should journals request more studies that are triangulated methodologically to be published, or should just a large sample be enough to justify this idea of replicability of research?
I guess I'm going first again. I'm going to go with it. It depends. If you're trying to tease out whether your results are because of, in essence, the research design, a larger sample won't answer that question. But two different samples or two different designs might. So multi-method, some form of triangulation might be important. If you're trying to figure out why you're getting results that are different than previous studies and you're presently doing the small sample, you probably need a bigger sample. That might be your first thing, right? So I think it depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. And the key thing that I was trying to get across is, if you're only arguing that you have conceptual links to previous work, you can't make those empirical linkages, it's going to be very difficult to sell that what you've found that's different or unexpected is actually valid.
So to add to that, and also coming back to the p-value question, I think there's a strong argument for going back to using our common sense. And this is why I emphasize warrant as opposed to proof. We are in such a habit of saying we're proving this, or we have demonstrated, or, but that's actually not what we're doing. So the way that I like to think of it is, we go into a jury trial, and what we need to do is present arguments that are going to convince a jury of our peers that our arguments are stronger than other people's arguments. And so one argument comes from different sources of information, and another argument comes from having a large enough sample size. But then if there is something that appeared like the probability of this happening by chance is only 1 in 20, it's like, okay, so it could very well be that this is the one time in 20 that it happened. Give me something else. But then when we talk about warrant, we just write smarter. Yeah. So I would say that these questions, rather than it being like these magical numbers that you get these numbers and your paper gets published, we need to write really well, argue clearly, help readers, and help reviewers to know what we're actually doing. Going back to what Mark has been emphasizing about transparency, they can do the same stuff with the data. And the thing that I would emphasize for authors here is, like we, the editors, we do not get any pleasure from rejecting papers. I am sad about every paper that I reject. Now, sometimes it happens that if I have enough to work with, I can replicate what is being done, and then I can understand what the authors are trying to say, and then I can help them say it. And I'm willing to do that if it looks like it's potentially interesting. Don't do that for every paper, but I have done that. And so just to think about the review team as a jury, and that you have to convince, that your arguments are strong, coming back not to conventional wisdom, but to good old-fashioned common sense, and then write it well and clearly. And there's no magic. None of these magic numbers are going to miraculously take you across the finish line.
It's interesting. I'm going to take a question that John has posted. Effectively, he's asking how critical it is to ensure that the core studies in a field are referenced in a published paper. And rephrasing, he says, in other words, are you always looking out for these core studies to verify knowledge and validity of the research paper before being accepted?
To cite them or to build on them properly? Is John still with us? Maybe John can ask the question himself.
Yeah, John, you can unmute your microphone if you want to. To publish them. He's asking the idea of, I guess, I think probably to not just to cite them, but to argue them properly. This notion of going with a common sense, is it, and John, please let me know if I interpret correctly, are you arguing whether we should go with the common sense that Suzanne is talking about, or whether we should go along with the previous arguments that are considered to be core in the topic to build on our study?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
Yeah.
So good morning from Toronto. So as I mentioned, I'm a seasoned executive, finishing my career with a DBA and well into it. So I always wonder, you know, from a journal perspective, when you get a new paper, are you looking at the references and the citations within that paper to verify that, yes, this person or these authors understand the field? Are you looking to identify where they're going a little bit off track? And how open are journals to introduce research or literature that is not necessarily the mainstream within that field? So I don't know if that sounds to you like a bizarre question, but I'm a practitioner, not an academic.
So Mark, you want?
You can go first this time.
You kind of had that look on your face. So that we as academics are each adding. We can think of a wall of knowledge, and sometimes we need to build walls together. But for simplicity, let's consider a single wall of knowledge. And so any author needs to very precisely define what brick they're trying to lay on that wall of knowledge. And if they don't do that, then they might be doing something interesting and creative, but it doesn't contribute to the wall, because we are here to serve the wall. And now, sometimes it happens that we have surprising results. And it is very challenging and requires, so I've talked about warrant. Warrant is, based on the quality of your arguments. And if you are going to be explaining that the shape of the wall needs to change, you're going to be doing some serious arguing. The other thing is that the papers that actually result in a change take longer to get cited. So that papers that are, adding one more construct and this is good, those papers get cited very quickly. People are happy. Everything's going the way people expect. Papers that kind of shake up thinking and require unfreezing some of our conventional wisdom, those papers might take 5 or 6 years before they get cited. I hope that kind of goes in the direction of answering, beginning to answer some of the questions.
Yeah, and so I'll use a different metaphor. I view the journal as an asynchronous discourse. And every article that's published is part of the discipline talking to others in the discipline. And so when you can't make linkages to previous conversations that we've had, you're doing one of two things. Either you're in the wrong room, right? You should be having a different conversation with somebody else, or you're doing something really, truly earth-shaking. You're changing the shape of Suzanne's wall or starting a new wall. 9 times out of 10, you're in the wrong room. And so it's not really that we care what you cite, but often when you see papers that aren't citing the ongoing discourse in the discipline, what people in the discipline are talking about, they're papers that are in the wrong place. And so it's not so much who you cite or are they the foundational studies, but it's showing that you understand how you're adding to the conversation we're already having, how you're building the wall.
Maybe can I add something here as well, and obviously you can have your take on it as well. But I guess that conversation in the room also refers to the journal in question. So if anyone submits a paper to John, the room is John, and therefore it's about citing previous papers in John and the associated journals as well, of course, in the field. Or to what extent do you think that it can be okay to reference people from much lower ranked journals or other sources?
So first of all, if a paper is being submitted to JOM, we are not expecting that people are going to be going and digging up anything possible that they can reference from JOM. It's more that if we come back to the idea of warrant, what are the arguments? What is the groundwork that has been laid? Where was it published? And so if the right article is published in a peer-reviewed journal that doesn't have a very high rank, but if that article does a good job of making a certain argument, those authors deserve credit. And you can have a highly cited paper that is published in a journal that maybe isn't as demanding. I actually had a paper that I particularly like. So one area that annoys me greatly is Six Sigma. And I have very strong things to say about Six Sigma. And I think that Six Sigma, the way that it has developed, the way that it emerged from industry, and the way that theory has developed around it, represents a lot of, field forgetting. And so that I had things that I wanted to say, and the higher you go in the food chain, the more the reviewers are going to force you to be diplomatic. So I published that piece in a journal that was going to be easier to, where I would have more control over the review process. And that paper has been cited. And I actually had some people get in touch with me and tell me how incredibly refreshing they found it. So, there's a reason for every journal in the field. If not, then the journals should disappear. But it's more like, where are the serious arguments?
Okay, thank you. And I recognize also that journal editors have to be careful as well in insisting that authors must reference papers from the journal. We've seen examples in recent past where there have been some issues because of that.
I think we need to conclude the session because we're about a minute away from an hour and a half, and I have to go teach in a class in a second, but I want to thank both Mark and Suzanne. It's been an enlightening. Mark, I think this is a ground-breaking paper. I think it's very significant. It informs all of us and in our operations supply chain community how to conduct more robust scientific research. I'm really glad that both of you were here, because these two journals are the pillars of our field, and that you're the gatekeepers, and to making sure that both were relevant into the community that we're serving in, but also to the academic discourse. I think it's kind of like raised a lot of questions in our heads on what needs to be done from our side, and also for a reviewer's point of view, and the journal's point of view, in terms of increasing replicability in our studies. I'll take this discussion for my research, definitely, on how to conduct more triangulated studies, on how to increase the nomology in my research, as you put it. But I also want to encourage, some greater discussion in academic conferences to make not a consensus on what needs to be done to increase replicability, because this is not just a paper or just a matter of a journal. It's a discussion that is wider for management studies. I have seen this discussion of replicability in different scientific fields, but not so much in management, at least from a policy point of view, rather than having somebody's ideas being published in the paper. So probably having this discussion at the academy conference or in POM will be very interesting, because that will legitimize the field of replicability, really, and how replicability in research can be encouraged. So thank you so much for joining these ideas in our seminar series. I'm going to stop the recording now. I think we don't need to record further, and then I'm going to share